you form a new company, that's the 45 deals, the increase in the incidence of staggered board is even stronger for the reasons that we discussed. Here are a couple of examples. This is an example where one company inherits a continuing entity merger, one company survives, and if you look at the details here, there is no reason why it should survive. It's the smaller company, and yet it does survive because it has a staggered board. And here is when you have a new company formed. Neither company going in had a staggered board. Surprise, surprise, the combined entity does. Okay, now what does that tell us? Well, for one thing, we should no longer assume that everything that shareholders approve is really good for shareholders, or as a special case that everything in the charter is good for shareholders, because maybe managers kind of cornered shareholders and told them, if you want this goodie, you better accept something that's not so attractive from your perspective. So that's the first point. Now the second point is, what do we do about it? It's very difficult to force managers to unbundle this bundle. But what you could do is let shareholders initiate charter amendments. If shareholders could initiate charter amendments and propose them and not just vote on them when management proposes them, shareholders could de-stagger the board or take out of the charter anything that managers put there in the first place through bundling. So that could be a good cure. Another interesting implication is what we call the survival of the entrenched and the survival of the entrenching. Over time, you'll see that in this sort of evolution, the companies that have a staggered board will, when there is a merger, will be the ones that will remain on top. And as a result, the staggering itself, the defensive tactic, will survive over time, even at the time that there is pressure by shareholders to get rid of staggered boards. The last implication has to do with Delaware takeover law. There is a well-known distinction between a deal where there is a change of control and a deal where there is no change of control. Where the company is sold, management is supposed, and the board is supposed to obtain the best price possible. That's the fiduciary duty of the board to do that. That's Revlon, the case from 1985. In contrast, when there is a merger where the company does not undergo a change of control, there is a much more enabling standard called the Unicol case, also from the same year, that says pretty much the board can get away with whatever the board sees fit. But maybe, even if there is no change of control in the sense that there is a new controlling shareholder in the company as a result of the merger, but just there is an adoption of a very powerful anti-takeover defense like a staggered board, maybe these deals too should be subject to the same exacting, the same restrictive Revlon standard that the courts should apply. Yeah?
Two very brief questions. First of all, in your slides, you repeatedly referred to charter-based classified. And I assume your data is risk metrics, which does not distinguish between charter.
No. This is, we coded every single. This is from the proxies. Yeah.
And the second question is, I don't understand the distinction between cash and stock deals. Stock has specific cash value that you can sell for cash. Cash is cash, and you can buy stock. So I don't see any distinction between stock and cash mergers.
You're right. The only reason is that if the shareholders receive cash, they don't really care what happens to the combined entity going forward. They don't care if it has a staggered board, it doesn't have a staggered board. So it's not a bundle from their perspective. They get their money and they go home. If the shareholders of the target remain shareholders of a new company, a combined entity, they do care, presumably.
Let me press it. I don't think that's a response, because if you get stock, you can sell it for cash. If you get cash, you can buy the stock, and you do care. So I don't see the distinction.
Well, if you receive stock, you can sell it. The question is how much you can sell it for. If the staggered board, as you have found in the past, lowers the value of your stock, You receive a lesser package than you could have received. And I should be clear, why would shareholders approve this at all? Because overall, the deal is value increasing to them. Maybe there are synergies that are associated with the deal, and so there is some extra value there. The question is whether shareholders will receive the entire extra value, the entire synergies, or managers will be able to skim some of it by introducing a staggered board, and that's what we find. But you're right. Shareholders will be able to sell the stock they get, and the stock will be sold exactly for its value. Yeah?
Paul?
So I want to follow up on that. I mean, basically what you're showing is that managers aren't getting the best price for the shareholders, and that's the basic takeaway. And the question is, why would you show it in this kind of convoluted way as opposed to just trying to figure out what was the best value that the shareholders could have gotten, and let's show why they're actually getting something much less?
Well, obviously we never know what the best value could have been. I mean, each deal has different synergies, different cost savings, and we never know how much.
This seems like a pretty weird proxy for not getting the best value, isn't it?
I don't see why it is weird. There are the managers. Here's a very simple setup. There is a period of 10 years, 15 years, when shareholders would never approve the introduction of a staggered board on a standalone basis. There is no case that I'm familiar with. And in fact, at the same time, shareholders pressure managers, and managers sometimes listen, asking them to get rid of existing staggered boards. There are a couple of studies on this. At the same time, managers get shareholders to approve this as part of the package. Why do managers, I mean, your question is really more broad. You're asking, why wouldn't all companies be run at an ultra-efficient level, and then managers will take a higher salary? Why do you see companies that are poorly governed at all? All of them should be well governed. All of them should make only the best deals, and then managers will take the money otherwise. But we do see that there are different ways of getting value from shareholders, and this is just one more, that's all.
Jim?
So one observation and one question. The observation is, I find this a tremendously useful paper. The implications to me are less clear than your empirical findings because, well, for example, the chance to get a staggered board might be an enticement to sell the company, right? So, I can't necessarily make the world more efficient by saying you can't get a staggered board if you sell the company, for example, by allowing shareholders to vote charter amendments, because that might reduce the incentives to sell the company in the first place, which might be bad, right? The question I have is if you really want to figure out if this is a story about bundling, right? How can you be so sure it is, right? It may be the case that, as you state, usually shareholders don't like staggered boards. Usually they won't approve them, right? But maybe the reason why they usually don't approve them is because they say, look, if you want to have a staggered board, it's probably because you don't want to sell the company, right? Whereas if it's in the context of a merger, there might be sort of less fear, right? Because you say, well, if you're selling the company now, that sort of shows, you're sort of a board that's willing to sell the company, and we trust you more than we would trust a board outside the sales context, right?
Yeah.
So what makes you sure this is a bundling story as opposed to just a sucker story where you go through to approving?
Right. So, I understand. So, obviously, if I were a cynical shareholder, I would say, of course, you're doing this merger now because you don't have a staggered board. But once we let you have a staggered board, who knows what will happen? I thought about this in a little different way, and tell me if this is related. Maybe what's happening is that the probability, and we haven't tested this empirically, we might actually, maybe the probability of a hostile takeover drops immediately after the acquisition, just because of the sheer size of the transformative event in the life of the company. It's just very difficult, or at least more difficult, to buy the combined entity than to buy either of its components. And so shareholders let it go. They say, it's probably we're not gonna get a hostile deal in the next 3 years anyway, and we have high discount factor, so we don't care. Well, at least we care less. But otherwise, shareholders should say, we didn't have a staggered board before. That's why we see this deal. If we let them get a new staggered board, who knows what will happen in the future.
You partly answered my inquiry, but it's really about what shareholders know and assume about staggered board, because according to the research that we discussed, it seems that staggered board is bad news for shareholders.
I'm sorry, it's staggered boards.
Staggered board seems to be bad news for shareholders in general. But how do we know that most shareholders are aware of that, and specifically shareholders in your sample?
Okay, so the shareholders are aware of staggered boards, or at least, you know, I can even say even more. Maybe it's not bad for shareholders. We believe it is. But shareholders also believe it's bad for shareholders. Institutional investors have voting policies that are completely do not tolerate staggered boards, and they certainly do not approve their introduction. Now, to some extent, some indication that they are aware of what they're getting here is something that we don't have in this slideshow, but we already have probably in the next draft of the paper. We tried to do an event study to see what happens to the stock price when the deal is announced. Now, this is not dispositive, because you can have some endogeneity where shareholders are presented with a bundle, with a bad bundle, let's call it this way, only when the deal is otherwise very value increasing, and so there is a lot of fat there, and so you may or may not see some announcement returns difference. But we do find that in the deals that are poorly received by shareholders, and those are presumably the deals where the market is really focused on the deal, these deals, you can see that the negative reaction is significantly worse when there is a staggering bundle than when there is no such bundle. And interestingly, the premium is higher. So what you see is managers are appeasing shareholders. There is a greater premium, but the market return is lower. The deal still gets approved.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Psychologist at the business school at Hebrew U. And okay, let's start. So basically, the questions that this paper tries to pose is, narrowly speaking, how do directors deal with a very famous shareholder versus stakeholder dilemma? And in particular, what we try to establish is the mechanism that makes or causes directors to deal with it. In particular, let me just go on. This is, you know, a daily exercise here in Israel. We're used to that. In particular, what we try to look for is the role of values in the way that directors deal with the shareholders versus stakeholder dilemma. Fundamentally, what this paper is about is what makes directors tick. And the exercise in which we try to address this question is a quasi-experimental approach. That is, we use vignettes. Let's have this thing go. So the exercise is essentially using a quasi-experimental approach by using vignettes that are based on seminal case studies. For instance, we draft a vignette that is based on Dodge versus Ford, and we ask the directors to assume that they sit on a board of the corporation and they had to make a vote. And the take-home lesson from this exercise is that there is such a thing as shareholderism. There are shareholderism stances, and those stances are actually systematically linked with values. Apropos the crisis, this is a conference on the crisis, the financial crisis and corporate governance. We find, in a way, that creditors and the relationship with creditors is something completely different, and I'll get back to that in more detail. So, the literature is huge. It's beyond belief. It's ridiculously huge. And it's huge in the law literature, and it's huge in the business literature, beginning with Berle, the famous exchange between Berle and Means in the early 30s, the business ethics and business strategy later on, literatures took on it beginning in the mid-80s. I won't bore you and I won't bother you with the details, because the situation right now, it has been actually for decades, that there's no resolution. Two camps keep forming, have been formed, keep forming, and the debate continues and kind of retitles itself, reincarnates in different shapes and forms, but the essential debate is between the two positions: shareholderism or shareholder wealth maximization, and some sort of a multiple stakeholder, multiple constituent, whatever way you want, but something that's more than just shareholders. The nasty thing about this debate is that the evidence is inconclusive. More recently, during the last couple of years, a number of meta-analysis studies came out, and they found some weak but positive association between financial performance and social performance, assuming you can measure social performance in a reliable way. But if there's anything that comes out of the empirical literature, is that there's actually a positive relationship. And the big debate right now is about causality. What causes what? Is it that good companies have more slack resources to engage in appeasing more stakeholders, or just do more good? Or is it the case that firms that are better managed among other things by better managing a number of stakeholder constituencies? There's very little theoretical work about the individual level, the actual director who faces questions or issues or strategic dilemmas having to do with shareholders versus stakeholders. And there's very, very, very little empirical work done about what considerations do board members take into account, how do they weigh the situation, and what makes them decide in one way or another. So this is a very under-researched field, and we try to make some contribution in this direction. So in terms of theoretical background, we use a psychological theory that deals with values. Values is a growingly popular construct in psychology. They are treated now as the essence or the core of identity. And just to give you a hunch of what values are abstract ideas. They are usually called the conceptions of the desirable. So these are abstract ideas about what's good or legitimate. They are transsituational criteria or goals, meaning that people apply and employ their values and value preferences when they address, when they face, when they judge different situations and different people. People actually draw on the values. They use them as guiding principles in their life, in assessing situations, as I just said, and so on. Now, most of the values that you can think of, especially when they're defined as conceptions of the desirable, are actually quite good. So it's not very informative to say that this value is important, that value is important. What's really informative, where the real action really is the relative importance, and is the ranking. And different people rank or give relative importance to different values. And more recent work in psychology has shown that values probably play a causal role. That is, people behave because they endorse certain values. They give high priority to certain values over other values. The theory that we use, the theoretical framework that we use is by Schwartz, Shalom Schwartz, the leading figure now in this field. What Shalom Schwartz has proposed is a universal model of individual values. And the point is that when you look at individuals in virtually every country, virtually every culture around the world, you can see a similar structure of values that people identify and relate to one another. And the model can be described graphically in this way. It should be a circle, but it doesn't really matter. Overall, across now in more than 70 cultures, tens of thousands of individuals, people essentially identify 10 different value types. So 10 different major conceptions of the desirable, and those 10 values, the 10 conceptions can be organized, these chairs, around a circle with two orthogonal, large, higher level dimensions. So one dimension that may be more kind of intuitively feel more intuitively familiar is self-enhancement versus self-transcendence. So values like power, wealth, power, control over others, achievement. This is something that would appeal to any academic here in the audience. Being successful, not necessarily by monetary criteria, but just by the assessment of peers, of the in-group, and so on. These are values that are focused on the self, on me. There are other values, like universalism, that captures the notion of general care for others, including general social welfare and environmental protection. There's a related value that is titled benevolence that is also concerned with the other, but the familiar other. Members of the in-group, family members, neighbors, faculty members, and what most people would tell you, and the evidence is very solid, that virtually there's a vast majority of people will tell you, it's more important to care about others, it's more important to help others than to care about me and to focus on my own success. But there's a huge variation among people in the relative importance given to caring for others and helping others versus caring for myself and looking after my own success. The other dimension is less intuitive to most people, and it does play a major role here in this paper. It deals with change. It deals with instability, it deals with uncertainty. One pole is called conservation. These are values of security, tradition, and conformity, seeking stability, seeking conformity, seeking certain rules, bright line rules, clear sources of authority, and so on. Versus on the other side, people giving higher value to new experiences, self-direction, stimulation, and things like that. Okay, so what's the theory? Basically, the central theoretical argument here in this paper revolves around the notion of entrepreneurship. And what entrepreneurship essentially comprises of issues of success, achievement, innovation, and essentially, if you go back, if you read the literature on entrepreneurship, it's about uncertainty. Who is better able, who has a better resources for addressing and absorbing uncertainty? And essentially, the inspiration we draw goes back to Joseph Schumpeter back in the early 30s as well, another giant, another old master, like Burley and Coase. And the portrait of the entrepreneur that Schumpeter offers talks about a dream to found a kingdom, the sensation of power, the impulse to prove oneself, not for the sake of success, not for the sake of monetary success, for profits, but for the sake of success itself. And the entrepreneur, according to Schumpeter, changes in order to change. He or she just likes this, and there's a delight in venturing. How is this linked to corporate governance and to corporate finance and corporations in general? Here we draw on the basic insight going back to Jensen and Mackling, saying that the shareholders are the entrepreneurs. So shareholders is the constituency that plays the entrepreneurial role in the company, in the sense that they bear uncertainty and so on. And therefore, the more specific hypotheses that we derive essentially say that directors would tend to support a line of action that promotes shareholder interests when they are more entrepreneurial in terms of their values, when they espouse, when they endorse, when they give high priority to entrepreneurial values. And what are these entrepreneurial values? These are the values that Schumpeter already defined 70 or nearly 80 years ago. Power, achievement, success, and the delight in change, self-direction and stimulation. We also make a hypothesis about social roles, but that we don't have much time for that. The method. We cover the entire universe of Swedish public corporations. I'm expecting a question about why Sweden in the Q&A. But we were able to access all the directors of all the Swedish public companies with a very, very surprisingly, a very pleasant surprise, high response rate, over 30%. Swedish corporate governance is, again, to me at least, was surprisingly similar in terms of the law that is prescribed. This is something we confirmed with a number of Swedish corporate law professors. Essentially what Swedish corporate law says is maximize shareholder value. You can do a lot of other things, but you should maximize shareholder value. A nice feature in public corporations over a certain size in Sweden that they must have a certain amount, at least 3 employee representative on the board itself. It's not a 2-tier board, it's a single-tier board with a minimum amount of employee representatives. They are chosen, elected by the employee work councils. And we also use a representative sample from Sweden. I won't show any advice. We measure values. Values could be measured. This is very, very solid. That's beyond the scope of this presentation. And what might be of more interest, we tell directors stories. Concise vignettes, concise stories, vignettes that are drawn from, the cases that all of us teach on a regular basis. Ford versus Dodge, Park versus Daily News, this is the British case, Crédit Lyonnais versus Pathé, Schlensky versus Wrigley, and we also have an item derived from a paper by Phil Tetlock at Berkeley, essentially asking directors, suppose the company is going to post a statement about corporate philosophy on its website. And there are 2 alternatives. One is shareholder wealth maximization, in so many words. The other one is a multiple stakeholder kind of philosophy. And people are asked to assume that they sit on the board and they need to make a decision. And what makes this real new in the literature is that these are not stories that we made up, we came up with. These are real stories about which directors had to vote and about which directors were dragged to court and were sued. The first finding is that there is such a thing as shareholderism, an approach, an ideology of dealing with shareholders, and it's a bipolar dimension, shareholderism on one pole, stakeholderism on the other pole. And this means, and I'll go very quickly over the results, this means that people who deal with us, shareholders versus employees, shareholders versus the community, shareholders in the abstract, in terms of the corporate philosophy, they do it in a systematic way. So they have a general approach that either supports or either prefers shareholder interests or supports or tend to prefer the interests of the other constituency. Now, there are certain differences within the different constituencies, but I'll take questions about that if people are interested in. What's interesting, and is actually a complete aberration, but it is relevant to the context of the financial crisis and shareholders versus creditors, a vast majority and a very kind of uniform result when you take into account board members who are employee representatives, that's on the left, the CEOs, that's in the center, and regular board members, that's on the right. When you ask them, when you give them a vignette based on Crédit Lyonnais, the famous footnote from Bill Allen about selling assets in the fire sale prices in order to finance dividend distribution, virtually everybody says, oh no. And intuitively, that this might make sense. What's interesting is that our subjects simply treat this situation completely separately from the shareholders versus stakeholder case, this shareholders versus stakeholder dilemma. This is a different thing driven by different factors, so essentially in the paper we exclude it, but it's an interesting insight in the present context. We do find correlations completely in line with the hypothesis, and let me jump directly to the regressions and close with this. What values make directors more likely to support shareholderism? As expected, directors who are higher on power, on achievement, people who think that making money and having control over others is relatively more important than other people, are more likely to be shareholderist. People who are higher on self-direction, who prefer to chart their own track and so on, are more likely to be shareholderist. Taken together, directors who uphold entrepreneurial values, typically along the Schumpeterian portrait of the entrepreneur, are more likely to be shareholderist. And there's an extra nice finding about a kind of push effect. Directors who are higher on universalism, care for general social welfare, are less likely, significantly so, less likely to be shareholderist. We control for a number of individual level factors. This is the section over here, so I'm nearly done. Older directors are more stakeholderist. They're less shareholders. They're less entrepreneurial, but this is already controlling for their values. This is above and beyond their value preferences. Women are much more stakeholderist. Men are much more shareholderist. Employee representative, as expected, tend to be, well, it's not obvious, because employee representatives are more stakeholderist, but they're more stakeholderist across the board, not just pro-employees. Okay? So there's something, what we argue in the paper, at least offer as a suggestion, is that the social role of sitting as an employee representative on the board, and let me just show you this slide, it doesn't make them completely stakeholders. In most cases, even the employee representative, these are the bars on the left, they are pro-shareholders. Okay? But the general pattern of their decision, they tend to be more stakeholderist than the others. People who are more shareholder, people who sit on more boards, have more tenure, more directorships, tend to be more shareholder. This makes sense. Sweden is dominated by pyramidal holding structures, so it makes sense that dominant shareholders pick candidates for the board. The very people who tend to be more shareholderist, things that you don't see in this table, we control for industry, we control for personal wage, for family wage, everything holds without change. Do I have time for one last finding? Okay. An interesting finding lies down here. This is profitability, measured by return on assets. And why is it interesting? Because this is a tiny bit of evidence. That is not the focus of the paper, but it's a tiny bit of evidence showing that board members who sit on more profitable on the boards of more profitable companies tend to be more shareholderist. So it's actually, if you can talk about causality, it's not the case that more profitable companies have more slack resources than they can indulge or engage in stakeholders or social performance. It's actually the companies that make more money are the board members in the more profitable companies are even more keenly focused on making more money for shareholders, controlling for all other items that or factors that we control for. Implications, numerous. I'll take questions.
In Sweden, does the board actually run that company, or are they sort of figureheads and we have an executive committee that runs the company?
They are, as far as we know, and we did some research about this, they do what you would expect the board to do in a public company with a dominant shareholder. So they monitor to some extent, but there's a dominant shareholder who does a certain amount of monitoring, at least implicitly. They provide advice. They sit there as a board of directors. This is the kind of question that they would get to vote on. Okay, one thing that we were concerned about is the applicability of US-UK cases, vignettes that are based on UK and US cases in a Swedish corporate governance context. And the people that we consulted told us that the cases would have been or could have been decided similarly in Sweden. So we feel very safe in using these vignettes with Swedish subsidies.
In Israel, it's very popular that there is a controlling shareholder situation. Can you address that? Is it also an issue under the Swedish reality? Yeah.
So let me just follow up on this question. So, it's possible to try and go to the following selection effect, which is controlling shareholders, directors who would maximize shareholder value, right? We're aligned with them. And they tend to pick the type of directors that you're finding, right? So, so just to follow up, I suggest that it would be interesting to find out how Ocean actually is.
I agree to the presupposition, but how does this lead to the outcome?
So let's assume that some of the companies have controlling shareholders and some don't, right? So the one with controlling shareholders to the directors. So those directors would tend more to satisfy the shareholders' needs than the other stakeholders on the shareholder side.
Okay.
So controlling shareholders also tend for some other reasons to pick directors that are more that have this kind of value, that are more powerful, that are more achievers, high achievers, more ambitious. Then there's a selection effect that creates this correlation, because the controlling shareholders pick this type of directors, and because the controlling shareholders pick them, they tend to satisfy the shareholders more than other stakeholders, but not because the values are related to it.
No, okay. So once again, I agree to virtually all the steps that you were taking, and except for the the final outcome, or the conclusion that you tried to draw. Sweden is predominantly dominant shareholders, dominant shareholder, or whatever. It's pretty much like the situation in Israel or in Canada. So we can safely assume that nearly all companies have a dominant shareholder. And the thing is that I don't care, in fact, because I fully agree with the proposition, and we see this is something I mentioned. People who tend to be more shareholderist get elected to more boards. And because the dominant shareholder is influential, is instrumental in making certain people as candidates for the board, we see an effect that is completely consistent with that. Given that, okay, within the people, within the board members that the dominant shareholders elect, there's a very large variation among them, okay, controlling for the employee representatives as well, that again tells you something about what makes a director tick. Yeah, controlling for all other issues.
Very good. So thanks for all of our panelists.
We have a 15-minute break and resume at 11:40.
Is Professor Jens Dahmen. Professor Dahmen is a member of the faculty of the University of Texas School of Law in Austin, where he teaches corporation and contracts. His research interests include corporate law, contracts, comparative law, and European community law. Professor Dahmen will speak about the incorporation choices of privately held corporations. Please.
Thanks for the introduction. So the paper we have today is really sort of central question for corporate law. A typical question. What's the background here, right? Everybody knows this, or most people in this room know this. In the U.S., corporations can choose the applicable law, right? They incorporate in the state of their choice. If they don't like it anymore, they can reincorporate elsewhere. We do have a system that has a potential incentive for states to attract corporations, right? They can impose franchise taxes. Now, whether and how hard they actually compete is a different question. And we have this huge, extensive debate on how the system impacts the law of public corporations, right? Extensive debates. Many articles. Is there a race to the bottom? Is there a race to the top? One of the most discussed, if not the most discussed question in corporate law. And then the question we asked ourselves is, well, what about privately held corporations? Not all corporations obviously are publicly traded. In fact, the privately held corporations are pretty important. One estimate that we found was by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It said, well, 51% of the private sector output goes back to privately held corporations. So that sort of gives you an idea. And so we asked ourselves, well, where do these people incorporate? And the conventional wisdom on this is pretty clear if you read the articles, is, well, these guys almost invariably incorporate locally. And there's a story behind this, and the story is, gee, corporate law is flexible, but the law governing closely held corporations is even more flexible than the law governing publicly traded corporations. And so these guys, the closely held firms, really have no incentive to go elsewhere. That's sort of the story behind this. And we tried to verify the whole story. And we used data that we got from the ICARUS database. We look at privately held corporations with 20 or more employees. Why do we have employees as sort of our threshold? That's simply because that's available for most corporations. We have a total of 266,531 observations, so that's a lot of firms here. And I want to go straight away to our main findings. It is true that most closely held firms incorporate locally, right? That is true if we look at the whole sample, especially sort of the smaller ones here. 96% incorporate locally. That's true for the firms with between 20 and 99 employees. However, then it gets interesting. Once we look at the larger firms, the larger ones, meaning sort of they're still privately held but larger in terms of size, they are in fact becoming more and more likely to incorporate elsewhere. And in fact, if we look at the largest privately held firms in our sample, meaning the firms with more than 5,000 employees, we find that almost 60% are incorporated out of state. And of those that are incorporated out of state, 80% are incorporated in Delaware, right? So this is, you know, if you know the number for publicly traded corporations, right, they're sort of the standard line as well. More than half of all publicly traded corporations are incorporated in Delaware. And if you look at our privately held firms here, you know, that doesn't look so different. Now, I really sort of want to drive this point home because the average corporate lawyer writes at least 2 papers on regulatory competition in his lifetime. So, you know, the next time you write such a paper and you sort of include the standard line which says Delaware leads the market for publicly traded corporations, just remember to cite us and say, and by the way, the same is true for large closely held corporations, and this will give us lots of cites. Okay. The next interesting question then is, of course, well, does the legal system matter, right? The whole regulatory competition debate is driven by the idea that states go to Delaware, corporations go to Delaware because they like the law, right? So the legal system is somewhat behind this. And when scholars say the legal system, they usually talk about either the courts, the Delaware courts are supposed to drive Delaware's position as the leading state of incorporation, and they also mean substantive law. So we looked at various factors, and in particular we looked at courts, we looked at the law on veil piercing, and we looked at minority protection, so the law governing the protection of minority shareholders. And the question being always, do these factors affect the decision of the corporation to incorporate locally or elsewhere, right? And if you look at these things, the first thing that comes to mind probably is how the hell do you code this, right? Because first of all, court quality are difficult to assess, but veil piercing a real nightmare, right? Veil piercing is all standard based, it's all alter ego and blah blah blah, right? So it's not sort of your favorite thing to code. And of course the same is true for minority protection, right? Because here you're dealing with fiduciary duties, and again, fiduciary duties are, you know, the standard example of a standard, okay, not your favorite target for coding. Let me say a couple of words on how we handle this. For courts, what we primarily used is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce ranking of state liability systems. That's sort of the most frequently used ranking if you want to rank courts. Now, there is a problem with this ranking, and the way this ranking works is they ask big, sort of basically big corporation lawyers and how they value court systems, and of course that may have a certain bias, right? If you have a big business bias, well, who knows, you might have sort of a controlling shareholder bias as well, for all we care. So it's not a totally objective way of valuing courts. We use some other measures as well. I'm going to talk about those later. But basically we use this, and we are sort of careful in saying what we did. Again, we're careful to acknowledge that this may not be a measure of objective quality. How about veil piercing? Here we basically relied on a study by Thompson, 1991. He actually did an empirical study of veil piercing cases and provided the percentage of veil piercing cases that were successful for each state law, right? So he exactly tells you, well, there were so many veil piercing cases decided on a Delaware law, and that percentage was successful. And we use his data to sort of construct various variables. Our main one is called easy to pierce, and basically if more than 50% of the veil piercing cases were successful, then easy to pierce is 0, otherwise it's 1. That's sort of the way it works. The last one, minority protection, that would presumably be the trickiest to code. Fortunately, there was a very helpful article by Mary Siegel, who had gone through the trouble of putting all the various states' fiduciary duties, duty of loyalty for closely held firms into categories. And here's what this is about, right? When states protect minority shareholders in closely held firms, they use two specific instruments. One is oppression statutes, right? So they have statutes saying if those in control oppress the minority, the court can dissolve the corporation, right? That's relatively easy to code because that's statutory. Then, of course, you have the duty of loyalty. Now, in the context of closely held corporations, the real duty of loyalty question is, well, to what extent do we apply partnership-style fiduciary duties, right? You all know, or most of you know the Massachusetts, Donahue line of cases where the court said, well, if it's a closely held firm, we really sort of apply the same fiduciary duty we have in a partnership, and so they have sort of this heightened fiduciary duty. Other states have been reluctant. Delaware said, we don't do this. So it's really sort of a question of figuring out what states have used what approach. And again, written this article where she has, these various categories as well. This is really partnership style. This is really not partnership style. This is somewhere in between. And we used that to build a variable. And basically what we did is, so the basic idea is we have this variable low protection. And low protection is one if the state has neither adopted an oppression statute nor has adopted partnership-style fiduciary duties for closely held firms. That's sort of the idea. Okay. Why does all of this matter, right? So, why do we care? Well, there's trade-offs here. First of all, we have the general edition, and what we're saying here is that we're saying, well, the literature is totally incomplete, right? You have competition, but all of you have just looked at publicly traded firms, and we're sort of supplying the missing part here, closely held corporations. So that's sort of the one payoff. If you look at the literature on privately held corporations, right, there's